Drive and have a bunch of interest in OAuth 2. And also with us is Ali. Ali, can you maybe present yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Ali. I work on Google Drive Developer Relations, also one of the developers of the OAuth Playground.
And Sergio, what about you?
Hi, I'm Sergio. I work in the London office. I work on the AdSense APIs.
So today we're going to talk to you a bit about OAuth 2, describing you how it works, how you can use it to authorize and use the Google APIs and access Google users' data, basically. So we'll go in a bit of details on how the flows works and how the protocol works in a very mostly practical point of view. And after that, we'll actually demo a bit how it works live with some data using a really cool tool called the OAuth 2 Playground that you'll see in a bit. And yeah, I guess that's it for the agenda. So, well, first, let's start. So, what is OAuth 2 basically? So, OAuth 2 is what we call an authorization and authentication, actually, protocol. We use it to basically allow third-party developers to access users' data on their behalf. Basically, they're going to gain access to the users' data. So, for example, to your contacts data or your Google Calendar data, that's hosted on Google Cloud. So, to illustrate that, let me first show you a real-life example of how OAuth 2 works out there. How have people been using it to access users' data? So, let me share my screen. All right. Share selected window. Are you guys seeing my screen? Sergio, Ali, yep.
Yep.
So this is MindMeister. MindMeister is one of the web applications out there that are using some Google APIs. They're an application to create mind maps. They have this mind map editor, which is really cool. I invite you to try it out. One of their features that kind of illustrate how OAuth 2 works is their sharing feature. So once you've created a mind map and you want to share it with your buddies or your colleagues or your friends, you're simply going to click share here, and you're going to be brought to this sharing dialog. And if you don't want to type the whole email address or you don't remember the email addresses of your friends and colleagues, you have this kind of like autocomplete button here. What it's going to do, it's going to ask and that's OAuth 2 here. We're seeing OAuth 2 in action right now. It's going to ask access to your Google Contacts data. So this is how OAuth 2 works. Basically, you have to redirect the user to this, what we call the grant page here, the grant screen, that asks the user if it can let this application manage their contacts here, for example. So let's say I kind of trust MindMeister. I'm going to allow them to access my data here. So how it works is we're redirected back to MindMeister, and MindMeister got these tokens. We're going to see a bit in a bit more details right after with Sergio how that works. But with this token, MindMeister is going to be allowed to fetch all of my contacts because I've given them the right to do so. And here, as you can see, this is all my friends and my contacts that are in my contacts, the ones you can see in Gmail, and they fetched and started fetching the list of all my contacts. And then you can use them, use these contacts that were on Google to share mind maps with your friends. Let me go back. So yeah, that was it about on how it works in real life, kind of like the user experience that you're going to see. And now we're going to switch to cloud. Sergio. Sergio is going to show you in a bit more details, the flow, how it works behind the scenes, basically, how the protocol works behind the scenes. And after that, we'll see with some more kind of live using the OAuth 2 Playground, see the protocol in action. So yeah, Sergio, if you could go ahead.
Sure. All right. Let me start by sharing my screen as well. I've got a little incognito window here set up with a couple of things that I want to show you. All right. So to start off, I'm going to give you just a quick look at the diagram for OAuth 2. And this looks really, really complicated, but as Nicolas showed you earlier, the user experience is actually relatively simple, where you get a prompt asking you to provide access to the different scopes which are being requested. You authorize it, and somehow magically the application gets all of the data that it needs, gets your credentials.
And Sergio, sorry to disturb you, but yeah, if that wasn't clear and if I haven't stated very clearly, the very, very big advantage between this and what we used to have in the past is that the user doesn't share their password. So you don't share your username and password with the third-party API, third-party application, and the third-party application only gets access to the data that you've allowed. So in the example before, only the Google Contacts data. They don't have your password, and they cannot go in Gmail and change it. They cannot get their password stolen. That that could happen with third-party applications or stuff like that. So that's one of the main advantage of OAuth 2. Yeah, sorry, Sergio.
That's all right, exactly. So all of the authentication part is handled by Google. So Google handles your password, making sure you are who you claim to be. And then the only thing that you need to provide with OAuth is the authorization part. So that's the part where you're asking the user to give you access to their data. So that's where OAuth 2 comes in, and that's where this diagram comes in. So the first thing that happens is that there is a request sent to the server. The user gets redirected to the authentication page. They perform their logging in, so the authentication step happens there, and then the user gets redirected back to your application on a callback URL that you specified. And I'm going to show you how to set up all of this from scratch with the new project on your APIs console. So once your application gets gets an exchange code that you can use, this exchange code, you then make a second request to the server, and you exchange this for tokens. And you get a token response, which includes two different tokens. One is a refresh token, and one is an access token. Now, the access token is the one that you can actually use to make requests. But this token is short-lived. It will only exist for a relatively small amount of time. That's where the refresh token comes in. This is a token that you can store on your side, which is specific to a user, and allows you to request new access tokens as needed. Now, I'm going to show you how to set up a new project using the APIs console. It's this address here, in case you haven't seen it. Once you sign up to the page for the first time, you get this little prompt, and you can create your own little project. And here you go. It creates a new project by default, just called API project. And you get a list of all of the different Google APIs that are available. You can enable it. You get a little terms and service. And once you accept that, you can then go into the API access page for your project, which by default doesn't have any OAuth 2 data. It only has your simple API access data, which only allows you to make unauthenticated requests. So any API that requires you to access protected user data will not work without an OAuth 2 authentication. So this is where you come here. You create a new client ID. You just give a little. You just give your project a simple sample here. And here is the important part. This is where you're choosing your type of application. Now, today we're only going to be talking about web applications, but there are also service accounts and installed applications. You can take a look at our documentation later on to see what the difference is with these different types of authentication. But for both server-side web apps and client-side web apps, it's web application that you need to choose here. And here you can set up your site or host name. You can choose between HTTP and HTTPS. Of course, you should always be using HTTPS where possible. You just input your site name here, and you create your client ID. Now, this will give you a couple of things. It'll give you a client ID, which you are going to make a part of your application so that it can identify you as a developer, and the client secret as well. Although I believe this is only used for installed web application, for installed applications, if I'm not mistaken. So that's it for the for creating a project. So how do you actually use this? So going back to the Webflow here, you're going to have to make an initial request, an initial redirect to send the user to the authentication page. You're going to get a code back. You exchange this code for the 2 tokens, and then finally you make an API call with the tokens. Right, I think that's mostly it for the web server flow. So I'll hand it off to Ali now, who should be able to... Oh, actually, just before that, I'd like to show you a quick demo of the server-side flow using our client libraries. We have client libraries for many different programming languages, one of them PHP. And that's the one we're going to be showing you today. There are samples already included with the PHP client library for the AdSense management API, and that's actually what I'm going to be showing you here. So I've got this set up on my local machine here. So I'm going to be calling these from localhost. It's actually the wrong URL, sorry. I'm going to be calling these from localhost. But of course, the experience would be the same if you had this set up somewhere online. So I'm just going to log into an account, and this is what you get. This is the user experience when you're when you're authorizing your application. This is what the user will see. So they just allow access.
Sorry to cut you right here. Just talking a bit more details of this page, the kind of parameters you pass it. So that's the URL that you see up there. That's where you passed all what we call a scope. A scope defines basically each of the APIs you want, or the kind of data you want access to. So here you've probably asked for the AdSense scope. You can add more than one. So if you wanted to have access to AdSense and Google Contacts, in the URL you would have added the scope for AdSense and for Google Contacts and for any other APIs that you wanted to have access to. And so yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Exactly. And to add on to what you were saying, you should actually request as many as possible in the same request, because every single time that you request access to a new scope, you're going to have to send the users through this authorization flow again. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you request access to all of the APIs you need at the beginning, so that the user only sees the authorization flow once, and this prompt here requests access to all of the applications in one single step. This will also help you later on when you're saving your credentials for later reuse, so that you don't have to send the user through the flow every single time they log into your website. That's actually controlled by this parameter here, which you see me highlighting, access type equals offline. This means that your application can request access to the user's data even if the user is offline, and also allows you to store this data for later use.
Yeah. That's basically going to give you the refresh token that we talked about.
Exactly.
The refresh token, which can be used in an unlimited period of time, unlike the access token. If you didn't have this access type equal offline, if you had access type equal online, we would only grant you an access token when you exchange the code, and you would only have access to the user's data for 1 hour, which is the current validity, the usual validity in Google APIs. The usual time to live of access tokens in Google APIs.
Exactly. So here, by clicking Allow Access, it's a little bit too fast, so you couldn't really see what happened, but the user got redirected back to the callback URL that we set up in the Google APIs console. And this callback URL is the one that handles the request. Now, the callback URL will get the code that we mentioned earlier. I'll show the flow here. So this code you then make a second request to exchange for the tokens. And the tokens, again, that we were talking about.
Just to be clear, the second request is done server side. The user doesn't see anything. So this doesn't affect the user experience. It's just exchanging the code to get the tokens. So we don't pass the tokens. There's a simple technical reason. We don't pass directly the access token and the refresh token in the URL back to the client in the server-side flow because we wanted to allow users to be able to use HTTP URLs, callback URLs. And as you all know, HTTP callback URLs could be intercepted by a man-in-the-middle attack. So the way or the workaround we found is that the OAuth 2 protocol defines is you send the code, and then this code is exchanged using your client ID and client secret, so your OAuth 2 credentials, to get the tokens back. So that's basically how it works.
Right. So going back to our example here, now that we are authenticated, we can run a number of requests on this. Here, just for illustration purposes, I'm just going to get all of the ad clients on this account, and we're getting an error here, of course, because this is a live demo, and all live demos have problems. But here, it looks like I authenticated with the wrong user that doesn't really have an AdSense account. So this is a response from the API. It's just not the response we're looking for. In any case,
no problem. We'll see later on the OAuth 2 playground. We'll run a bunch of other demos using other APIs that should work flawlessly.
Exactly.
Hopefully, we cannot do worse now. We failed all our demos, our first one, so now we can only improve from now on.
It can only improve from now. That's correct. All right. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what you can do to prevent the user from going through a lot of authorization requests. So as we were mentioning earlier, if you set up your access type as offline, it means that you will get back both an access token and a refresh token. Now, the access token is the one you can use to make requests immediately, but it's important that you save this refresh token. Sorry. This refresh token is per user and per scope, so it only works for the scopes that you initially requested. Once you store it, this token is valid indefinitely. The only way that it can get revoked is if the user logs into their account settings and revokes access to your application. And once you have this refresh token, then you can use it to automatically, without redirecting the user anywhere, get new access tokens to be able to access the same data. So it's important to note this, because if you don't ask for offline access, and if you don't store these refresh tokens, you're going to be prompting your users all the time with authorization requests, and they're going to get very sick of your application very soon. All right, so things work a little bit differently on the JavaScript side of things. So if your application is client-side rather than server-side, and Ali's going to be talking to you a little bit more about that. Ali?
Thanks, Sergio. So you've just mentioned a really interesting point about the web server-side flow. It's in two steps, really. The first step is between the user and the auth service, where the user says, yes, I'm happy, yes, I am myself, I've authenticated, I'm happy to grant access. The second step of it was an exchange between the server, i.e. the application, and the OAuth service. And that exchange involves the application's credentials. So it's two steps. One, the user's credentials, the other one is the application's credentials, and they all get together and agree that this is a good thing to happen. Now, the difference in JavaScript on the client in the browser is that nothing is secret. So you know that you just can't keep a secret in the browser because someone can just look at the code. And so instead of having the two-step process, we say, okay, fine, we won't do that. We'll have a single-step process where instead of asking for a code, which you can then exchange for a token, you just ask for a token. And that token comes back in the form of a fragment in the URL. Okay, so that just prevents it from being...
It's important to note here that fragments in the URL cannot be intercepted by a man-in-the-middle attack. Only the browser sees it. So the fragment parts are only browser side and don't go through all the hops, all the servers that redirects the request, the actual HTTP request. So that's why it's actually secure to give an access token directly in the URL in a hash fragment. And that's the main difference between the JavaScript flow and the server.
So it's exactly right, Nicholas. It's safe and it only takes one step. Sergio, could you possibly stop presenting? Is that possible? He's gone.
Am I still presenting? I'm sorry about that.
Please.
All right, there we go.
Okay.
Should be good now.
You make a similar kind of request. You redirect the browser. You again need a redirect URI. The scopes are exactly the same. Another main difference in when you're calling it is there's no potential to have offline. You can't get a refresh token in this case. If you could get one, where would you store it? There's nowhere to store it. There's no way to be secret. So we don't have available offline access. One addition that we do have, one extra feature here, is that we allow your application to decide whether or not the user will be prompted. So in some cases, of course, the user will have to be prompted. They've never granted access. But once they have granted access, if your token's about to expire, which it will after 60 minutes, you can just run the flow again, but this time passing auto. And if you pass auto for the approval prompt, it's clever enough to know whether or not the user should be prompted. So this sounds kind of a bit complicated, and to be honest, writing it yourself is not exactly straightforward, which is why the easiest way of doing this is using the Google Client Library that actually handles all of this for you. So you make a single call, and you have a token, and you can use that token really for as long as the session lasts by using an auto, and the user will only be asked for their access once. Now, to show you how that happens, Nicholas is going to go through some samples on the OAuth Playground. Now, the OAuth Playground, because it's specifically a tool to allow you to debug and experiment with OAuth 2, we allow you to do these various kinds of flow, and perhaps you might want to experiment with them yourself to decide which one is for you and which one is for your application. Certainly, if you don't have a heavy server-side, making a call to an API in JavaScript is one of the most simple things you can do without having to add additional code. So if you can get away with this, if you can get away with the client-side flow and making client-side requests, then the JavaScript client-side flow is for you.
All right.
Any questions, Nicholas, Sergio? Anything to add to that?
No, I just wanted to add also that when you use a refresh token to get a new access token in the server-side flow, that's called refreshing your token, but our client libraries usually handle that automatically. So our client library for Java, for PHP, etc., for Ruby, you just pass it your refresh token, your access token, and it's always going to refresh the token, behind the scenes without even you noticing it. So you don't really need to care about this or need to handle this. Just pass it the refresh token automatically. The client library is going to get new. Pass it the refresh token automatically. The client library is going to use it to get new access tokens once your credential have expired.
Right. So, sorry, just to add to that, I just want to say that we actually have different client libraries for different languages, and each one actually handles things the correct way that you would expect things to be handled natively. So, for example, the Java client library allows you to use JDO to store your credentials and automatically access them and refresh them and rewrite them once they're accessed and all that. The Python one uses native storage. The Ruby one has different options as well. So they all handle this pretty much as you would expect in the specific language. And they all have documentation so that you can take a look at how to take advantage of these features.
Now I'm just going to show you how things work in details, looking at the protocol using the playground. So let me just share my screen here. All right, everybody sees the playground? Yeah, I guess so. So this is the OAuth 2 playground. You can access it going to developers.google.com/OAuth playground. And as Ali mentions, it allows you to use some of our APIs with OAuth 2 and experiment and see how the protocol exactly works. So, for instance, I'm going to use the Google Contacts API. That's going to be the first example I'm going to show you. So the tool is actually pretty configurable. You can use server-side or client-side flow here. You can even use it with other APIs that Google. Just go to custom, and you have to specify a bunch of things. But there's a bunch of APIs that also work with OAuth 2 that are compatible with this tool. So I invite you to try it out. So let's go. So contacts here. The first step is to actually redirect the user to the grant screen. So you do that on the tool, clicking on the authorize APIs. And as I'm already signed in, I'm directly prompted, that the tool wants to access my contacts data. So I'm going to allow it access. On the right side of the tool here, we show exactly what happened. So the step that we've seen here is redirecting the user to the grant screen, and that's done by simply redirecting it to this URL that you need to construct. And you can see a bunch of the parameters here. Access type equal offline, we've talked about that. The scope here, the scope is the Google Contacts scope. We can see later on, I'll add a few more APIs to see when you add more scopes what it does. Approval prompt equal force, that's a URL parameter that what it does is that the prompt that the user has seen is always going to show up. You can also remove that URL parameter, and the prompt is actually only going to show up the first time the user approves the URL. I'm going to remove it in a second so you can see that the second time I want to authorize the API, I'll get redirected automatically. The user will not be prompted to authorize. So as you can see here, we've been redirected and passed a code. The code is the first step of the server-side flow. You have it, and you need to exchange it against an access token and a refresh token. So you can see the code, the tool copy-pasted here automatically in the little input here. It's pretty nice. And how you initiate the exchange, you simply click that button. And as you can see, we've gotten a refresh token and access token. So let's go back and see how that worked exactly. So to exchange the code for a refresh token and access token, what you do is you send an HTTP request, a post HTTP request to basically https://accounts.google.com/o/auth2/token. If you're fluent in the HTML protocol, that's the request on top, and below is the response we got from the API. But basically, you construct the URL using the post and the host here. And what we've done is we passed inside the body of the request, we've passed the code, the redirect URI, which we've used in the first step, our client ID that we've got in the APIs console that Sergio has shown you earlier, and the client secret as well. Here it's hidden because it's the OAuth 2 playground ones, and we don't want to really disclose it, but it would be your own client ID and your own client secret when you use when you use OAuth 2. And grant type authorization code, because we're passing an authorization code and we want an access token and a refresh token in return. The response is a 200 OK response that contains a little JavaScript object here, JSON object, which, as you can see, contains a refresh token and an access token, and also expires is the time to live in seconds for the access token. So the access token will not be valid in basically 1 hour. And as you can see here, we have a little countdown to show you when exactly that finishes. You can refresh the access token using the refresh token. You can click that button. The tool will show you how to refresh access tokens. So again, it's a very similar request where you pass the client secret and the client ID and the refresh token. And the grant type is not code this time; it's refresh token. And the tool gives you back a new access token that's valid another 1 hour. So when your first access token is expired, you just get new ones like this. Now let's go to the third step of how to use Overflow is basically when we use the token to access the API. And there are a few methods to basically authorize your requests. So Google APIs, they are mostly REST-based. So you send a GET request to a URL endpoint to basically list the contacts if it's the contacts API, or get a contacts, or a post request if you want to insert a new contact, or a put if you want to modify one. What I'm going to show you is we have a little something really convenient in the tool. We're going to show you all the endpoints of the API for you. You don't have to go through the doc and find the correct URL. And if we want to list all the contacts the user has, that's here. You need to send a GET request to that URL here. I hope you see it and the screen isn't too small. And you need a special mandatory HTTP header GData version, specifying the version of the API, because we have previous versions it works a little differently, and then that just tells the during the request which version you want to use. Here we want to use the latest, which is version 3. So I'm just going to click on it. It's going to set up my request for me. So we want to send a GET request to that URL. So when we click Send Request here, boom, we've sent a GET to the URL we've described on the left. We have the extra header here, GData version, and the important part, that's how you authorize to our APIs. You pass an authorization header. Then there's a few ways to actually write that authorization header. Here we've used authorization column OAuth. That's from the older protocol. The OAuth 2 protocol was for a long time in being written, being discussed. And in the earlier version of the protocol, we used OAuth as a prefix here, and then you pass the access token. In the newer version, you use bearer. So the tool actually supports all that. You can go and change from OAuth prefix to bearer prefix, just to show you that it works exactly the same here. That's the new authorization header with bearer. And there's a third way to authorize, is to use a URL parameter instead, which is actually quite convenient, is to use the access token URL parameter. And here, if you want to authorize, boom, we've simply added the access token. Instead of setting it in a header, in an HTTP header, we've simply appended it to the URL. So with the question mark, access token equal, and the access token. That's exactly the access token that we've gotten back from the second step here. And you can see below, it's quite hard to read because it's XML data back from the API, but we've gotten all my contacts that are available in my Google contacts list. So that was a little showcase of the server-side OAuth 2 flow, which contains basically 3 steps: redirecting the user to the authorized page. The second step is exchanging the code for a token, and then the third step is simply use the API using the access token. Now I'm going to show you how to use the tool with the client-side flow and how the client-side flow works. So here I simply click here. You see there's one less step, only step 1 and step 2. And if we go, and if I want to authorize contacts again, I'm going to click authorize. It's going to be the same exact page, except you cannot request for offline access. So there is not the little message that tells you that the tool or that the application is going to access your contacts in the background for a long time. So you don't get that message because the client-side flow doesn't give you a refresh token. So you don't really have offline, back-end server access. And we got redirected back to the tool. So as you can see here, let me go back. We've got in the URL, in the hash fragment, directly the access token. So that's why there is one less step, basically. You already got directly the access token. No need to exchange the code for an access and a refresh token. Very simple. You get the access token, and you can use it directly to send your request, for example, to the Google Contacts API. One less step, very, very simple. The main difference that you will not get refresh token, which allows you to, get unlimited access in an unlimited period of time. So, if you need to access the API for more than 1 hour, there is some techniques that you can use on your web page if you're on a JavaScript enabled web page, and you're using this flow to get an access token. Some of the common techniques are to use like a hidden iframe to trigger a flow inside and get a new access token, or trigger a pop-up instead of redirecting the user back and forth to your website. Trigger a pop-up that, if the user has already granted you access, should directly give you a new access token that's again valid 1 hour. Of course, you can only do that while the user is on your web page, which is the main difference between the client-side flow and the server-side flow, basically. Guys, is there anything else you'd like me to demo or talk about?
Is there any way we can have questions? People could ask questions. People have been sitting
here,
patiently waiting. Thank you all for listening. Do any of you have anything you'd like to ask? If not, I can think of some questions.
Oh, we can actually demo the playground with Google Drive. This GDL was supposed to be a bit about Google Drive and AdSense I'm going to show you a little bit how it works with Google Drive. I'm going to go back to the server-side flow here. So Google Drive, is this kind of like online or in the cloud hard drive that we've launched a couple of months ago. It has a really cool API, a really cool SDK, actually. You can do a lot. The really, really basic way to use Google Drive is to use the API here with this scope. The scope is, I'm going to highlight it here, googleapis.com/auth/drive. I'm simply going to show you how it works with the playground. You request access, you get the prompt. Again, you get an authorization code, which I'm going to exchange. That's below is the older refresh and access token from before. I'm going to exchange that authorization code for a new refresh and access token, which I've gotten. And now, if I want to use the API here, I have a bunch of endpoints, lots of things you can do with the API. The most common one would probably be to list files. I just have to find it. It's somewhere. List parents? No, list files here. So if you want to list all the files that you have in your drive, you're simply going to send a GET request to that request URI. Here I'm going to remove the GData header. Let's try it out. Could be quite big. So here I have a bunch of files in my drive. That's my drive here. As you can see, a bunch of images, everything. Let me go back to the playground. And as you can see here, for example, so the newer, our older APIs in Google used to be XML based, and our newer kind of APIs, now all the new APIs are mostly JSON based. So which is when you're getting here, a JSON response. So you can see in the items you have all my files. For example, this is my first file title. That's my accounting spreadsheet. Which has special MIME type because it's a Google spreadsheet. You can see if it's starred, yes, it's starred, modification date, etc. And then you can use the API to, for example, insert new files to Google Drive or modify files, modify sharing, etc. There's also a really cool feature of the Google Drive SDK is that you can have your applications integrate directly inside Google Drive. So, for example, here, if you look at the PNG here, that's an image file, a drive logo. You can open it with, we now let you open it with third-party applications. And actually, the OAuth 2 Playground is one of these applications. So if you want to have the OAuth 2 Playground listed here to open your files in Google Drive, you can simply go to the Chrome Web Store, the Google Drive apps collection, which is here on the left, Google Drive, and you'll find that's all the apps that are Google Drive enabled that you can install on your drive, which have the right-click open with functionality. The OAuth 2 Playground is one of them, and you simply install it, and then you'll be able to do this, which is right-click open with the OAuth 2 Playground on any files. We go through that kind of describes how it works if you're developing a Google Drive apps. So if you're developing Google Drive apps and the user clicks on a file inside Google Drive, we'll redirect him to your website with special URL parameters that you can see here. We'll give you a code right away, a code that's the OAuth 2 protocol that you need to exchange for tokens. But we also give you here a JSON object in the state URL parameter, which contains the ID of the file that the user just opened and the action that happened. The user opened the file. Here is the ID, and you now have access using the authorization code. So here, if I exchange the code, that I'm getting a refresh token and access token, and here the tool is nice. It gives you right away the URL to the file to get the details of the file. So here is how Drive works. You get the details of the file. Here it's drive logo.png. It's a PNG image. It is not starred or anything. You have all the created, modified date. So that's the metadata of the files. And if you want to download the actual content, here you have download URL, which you can request, sending an authorized request with OAuth 2 as well, and you get the actual content. So here, if I do an authorized request to that URL, you see I'm getting PNG binary data. That's my file here actually. All right.
So just before we run out of time, I'd just like to do a quick AdSense demo as well with another tool which will be very useful to you no matter what API you're developing in. which is the Google APIs Explorer. And I've got it open up here to show you the methods in the AdSense Management API. Now, you can get a list. This uses the same data that is used to generate our documentation, by the way.
And just a quick note, so the main difference, I wanted to state the main difference between the APIs Explorer and the OAuth 2 Playground. So the OAuth 2 Playground really explains you how the protocol works step by step, and then you can use it to access APIs, Google APIs. The APIs Explorer here, it's kind of going to hide all the OAuth 2 protocol that happens, all the OAuth 2 stuff, and just lets you play around with the APIs. So
exactly. And it's going to be very useful for you to figure out how to make requests. So in this case, for example, I first just want to list all of the ad clients in my AdSense account. So I find the method here, I click it, and you see that it automatically gives you a little form with all of the parameters that the method expects. Now, since this is an authorized request, you're going to have to go through the OAuth flow as well here. And the tool has this convenient little thing set up here. You can choose which scopes you want to get access to. Since I only want to read data, I'm just going to choose the AdSense read-only scope, and I authorize it. It gives me a pop-up, which you probably didn't see due to the way that screen sharing works in this, but now I should be able to make my request. And if I click the execute button here, sure enough, I get all of the ad clients listed. And the same thing works for other methods, like the most important and most used method in the management API, the method which allows you to generate reports. As you can see here, it shows you all of the different fields that you can fill in, all of the mandatory ones, which are highlighted in red, and all of the optional ones. And you can just fill these in, click execute, and see what happens. If I click here, just tell me these parameters are required. But if I were to fill them in with the date, let's say 2001, 01, 01, and 2012, 01, 01, and then just add a couple of dimensions and metrics, like, for example, reporting based on month, and just adding another metric, which would be, for example, earnings. This would allow me to get a report for all of my AdSense earnings between those two dates. And here you go. You just get your list of rows, and they're all they've all got the information you need. So you can just take this JSON, put it into your application, and build some graphs with it, or some other sort of visualization.
Nice. So Ali needed to go, and we have a question from Gary Frederick here on the chat, on the group chat on the left. He wanted to know how you can use OAuth 2 on Android. So actually, OAuth 2 on Android, there's two main ways to use it. One of the ways would be to actually use, and that's what people are doing on iOS mostly, is to use an embedded web view. So you basically your app, if it's a native Android app or a native iOS app, would trigger a web view and start the flow, the OAuth 2 flow, inside the web view. And you would get the code back. So you're going to use the server-side flow for this. You're going to read the code from the URL once the user has approved your flow, and then use the code inside your app to do the exchange of the code for tokens, etc. And then once you have the access token, the refresh token, you save that and you can use it, in the background to access the APIs. So in Android, there's another way to do that, only on Android, not on iOS, which is the preferred way, actually, which is what the Android team wants us to do. And so it's to use the account manager. So I can't show you the code right now. It's actually a bit long, but it's available. You can find samples of that I think the tasks API documentation had that, or you can also find it, of course, in the Android documentation somewhere. No, so the account manager does not have refresh tokens. What it does, it's going to handle the refreshing for you. So what you do is you use the account manager and use it to request access to the user's data. And the account manager has a special UI for approval. And what it's good is that it uses the accounts that are already signed in or already set up in your device. So it's going to pop up, a nice little window, a native window, asking, well, this application wants to use, kind of like all the authorization you have on Android. If you want to access the internet or the calendar data, there's a way where you can set it up to access OAuth 2 APIs. So in the code, you actually, when you specify the type of data that we want to access, you use, I think, something like OAuth 2 column, and then add the scopes. And then, so the UI is going to show you, okay, well, this application wants to access, for example, the contacts data and also the Google Drive data, etc. And if the user approves, the intent is actually going to provide you with an access token directly. So it's not going to give you a refresh token. It's always going to give you an access token. Though what your app can do is go through this flow again subsequent times when the access token has expired. And same thing here, the user is not going to be prompted subsequent times. Since the user has already approved, next time you request it, the intent is already automatically going to give you the access token. So that's kind of how the refresh is done. So use the account manager, set the OAuth 2 scopes, and give it the OAuth 2 scopes you want to access, and then you'll have a nice native flow who directly gives you the access tokens.
I just want to add something to that. If you're going to be doing development in Android and accessing Google APIs, you should definitely take a look at the Java client library for Google APIs because it handles a lot of this stuff for you behind the scenes, so you don't have to touch any of this complicated stuff. And it has some very good sample code on how you can do authorization with in Android.
Yeah. So Gary's comment here, the Java client library was not as clear. It's true. It's not. It doesn't, because it's mostly targeted as web apps. For web apps. Sorry. Right now, though I think there is extra packages. They have like the jars have a suffix like Android or Android 2 or that kind of stuff, which you can use. Which gives you a bunch of helpers to do this. But the best is to find a sample, and I think there is a specific Android sample in the Java client library samples. You need to specifically look for it. If you look at the other Java samples, of course, it's web apps. And you really need to look at that sample. There used to be, I actually built a sample that was using the tasks API, using OAuth 2. It was about a year ago, which is slightly outdated. You can find it online. It's very easy. Type tasks API Android sample or something. But it's slightly outdated because the Android SDK has evolved since then.
Yeah, but I just want to point out that they've actually been making a lot of improvements to this in the Java client library. So I'm not sure how long ago it was that you took a look at this, but but they've made some recent improvements.
Yeah. No, look really inside. Actually, try not to look too much at my Google Task sample because it's really outdated. Really go inside the Google APIs client library samples on Google Project Hosting, and that's where you'll find usually up-to-date samples for this. And then, yes, you'll have to use the Google APIs client library for which you can add helper class. I think there must be one for cloud storage since it's what you want to use. And then you use the cloud storage specific binaries that we published with it, which should give you easy access to all the cloud storage stuff. But I'm not super familiar with cloud storage. If it was Drive, I could help you better. I think that cloud storage, however, is not going to use the user's credential. Cloud storage is more for user's developer credentials, so you have to use your own credentials to access the cloud storage, which might be a little bit different, a little bit tricky. So,
Nicolas, I think we're going to have to talk to the Android team and try to convince them to have an OAuth session of their own, because it might help a lot of folks out there.
And definitely, because yes, and Gary. Because we're out of time, so we have to leave the chat very soon. But feel free, go on Stack Overflow, post your questions. We always go on Stack Overflow a couple hours a day, try to answer questions, and ask your questions there. Use the correct tags, we'll find it, and we'll help you out from there and give you specific information just for you, for your use case. All right. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Gary.
We might have time for one more question before we have to go. So if anyone has any questions on the web server flows, client side or server side, ask now.
We give you 10 seconds. You can put it in the group chat if you're too shy to talk out, to speak out. Oh, they're all muted. Maybe that's because it's a Hangout on air. Okay.
Right, exactly.
You guys are not shy. You're going
to have to use the chat if you have a question for us. Sorry about that.
All right. If there is no questions, guys, then just seeing what Gary is typing.
Why is
OAuth so hard? Well, let me tell you, it's much easier than OAuth 1.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. If you ever had to deal with the auth 1, you wouldn't be asking that question.
Yeah. But definitely use our client libraries. If you just understand the flow, all the protocol is hidden for you. You just have to know, what authorization, the authorization pages, what refreshes actually refreshes mostly hidden. So this makes it way simpler. And look at the code sample. Usually most of the stuff is really hidden by our client libraries. The protocol itself, yeah. Yes, definitely. So the thing is, OAuth 2 was really like
you're going to
a final spec.
The question because people watching the video later won't be able to know.
Oh yeah, we have to read the questions. You're right. OAuth 2, some of the documentation is still needing updated, but getting updated every day. Yeah, so the OAuth 2 spec was under, still in draft, and still a draft, though I've heard that the spec has just been frozen, so it's soon going to be like a real spec, a final spec, and then, we can spend more time updating the doc, publishing nice stuff around that, good tools. Now that we know the spec won't change, because right now, if you look at all the OAuth 2 providers, like Facebook or that uses OAuth 2, it's actually quite different from the way Google uses OAuth 2. It's simply that we haven't implemented OAuth 2 at the same time. Google is still is always kind of like updating it to meet the latest standard, but Facebook's probably using an older standard and updating it as well. And it's currently a moving target. It has just been kind of frozen, so it's finally going to be a little nicer. Things probably, hopefully, are going to start being cross-compatible. We'll see. So another question from Gary. Can I have a token that works for Android and Chrome web apps? Does that make sense? Yes. So the token that you get from Android, the access token, you could use it on your Chrome web app, though you're not going to get a refresh token from Android. So it's always going to be access tokens, which are only valid 1 hour, which you could, if you wanted to have a protocol to send it from your Android app to your Chrome backend, to your Chrome web app backend, if you wanted. That maybe it's better to do it the other way. Get a refresh token and an access token from your Chrome web app, and have some little callback between the two. So from Android, you get tokens from your Chrome web app backend, and of course you can use the access tokens from Android or from Chrome from a web app. They all work the same way. So you'll definitely be able to do that if you find how to fix or work around the trickiness around Android that doesn't give you an access token and a refresh token. Sorry, a refresh token.
I just want to point out that you can have as many projects as you want. So if these are two different applications, you should probably get two different sets of developer credentials for both of them and try to get your users to authorize both of them. Now, yeah, right. Okay, so I see you're on the chat that you're commenting that it's the same application. Right,
yeah.
So
simply you probably don't want the users. Sorry, you probably don't want the users to have to authorize twice.
Right.
You want the user to think, oh, I'm already authorized on the web app, and I don't want to authorize again on the Android app. That seems weird. I've already authorized. So probably the best way, if you do it from Android the first time, is to go through a web flow, a web view, an embedded web view, and get the refresh token, the access token, and save it in your common database, and use that common database for both apps. And you know, same thing if you're coming from the Chrome web app, I guess. That's probably the best way for you. It's a little bit tricky to do it from Android. And we don't have helpers to really help you do OAuth 2 from a web view, though, because we're trying to push more for the account manager use case.
Right. And but then he'll have to also go through the web app every time that he needs to generate a new access token. So it needs to be the web app generating a new access token from the refresh token that it originally.
Or you could have the refresh token saved into your Android database, but the real trickiness is that you need to use your client ID and your client secret to use the refresh token, and that's usually something you really, really want to keep secret, and you don't want people to, you know, take your APK and reverse engineering it, and you know, deobfuscate it, and be able to read your client ID and your client secret, and use that to kind of hack and take your quota and that kind of stuff. So you'll probably need to have secure communication between your Chrome, your Android app, and you know, and your backend that holds the refresh and the access token. To talk more, definitely, I mean, right now, Stack Overflow is your best bet. We can really have a conversation on Stack Overflow, start a forum. You can probably find me on Stack Overflow as well, Nicolas Garnier. You can probably, I think there's a way in Stack Overflow to add me with a plus or an @Nicolas Garnier or that kind of thing, so I get notified. Or you know, I'm also on Google Plus. If you post a question there or an open discussions or an open forum, ping me the link on Google Plus on my profile, and you know, I'll get on it and we can chat there. Stack Overflow is great because everybody can see the discussion, and if it contains, you know, valuable resource, everybody will see it. So that's what we like about it. It's more scalable.
All right, we're already almost 10 minutes into overtime, so I think we're going to have to end this one here.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the questions, and thanks for listening all the way. And Gary, you know, please follow up on Stack Overflow. I'll be happy to help you there. So yeah, we hope you liked it.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.